And I've never forgotten the moment when both Havel and Dubček, the hero of 68, were together on stage, and the news came through that the whole Politburo had resigned. And everybody erupted in applause. Havel and Dubček, the man of 89 and the man of 68, embraced very warmly. Champagne was produced from somewhere. It was like a fairy tale.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you subscribe in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. Professor Timothy Garton Ash is a British historian, author, commentator and Professor of European Studies at Oxford University. Professor Garton Ash witnessed some of the most critical moments in the Eastern Bloc during the 1980s as these populations threw off communist rule. He provides us with vivid details of his time in East Germany, Gdansk in Poland in 1980 when the first free trade union in the Eastern Bloc was formed, and his time with then dissident Vaclav Havel when the Czechoslovak Communist government resigned in 1989. Professor Garton Ash genuinely had a front row seat to history and provides us with fascinating and profound analysis of those incredible years. Now, I know some of you think this is my full-time job. Well, sadly it isn't, but I really do need your help to allow me to find the time to continue producing and preserving these Cold War stories. I'm asking listeners to pledge a monthly donation of at least $4, £3 or €3 a month to help keep the podcast on the air, although larger amounts are welcome too. You can cancel this pledge at any time. The donations would be made via Patreon, and you will get the sought-after Cold War Conversations drinks coaster and bask in the warm glow of knowing that you are helping to preserve Cold War history. Just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. If a financial contribution is not your cup of tea, then you can still help us by leaving written reviews wherever you listen to us, as well as sharing us on social media. It really helps us get new guests on the show. So, back to today's episode. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Timothy Garton Ash to our Cold War conversation. Now, I've read most of your books. In fact, I have 3 of them here on the table with me. And I was going to start off with The File, which was, I think, the first book I read of yours, which is about your time in East Germany and your examination of your Stasi file. And I was interested to read in that pretty early on in your life or in your student years, I think you were tapped up by MI5.
Almost like a scene out of a Le Carré film, the head of my undergraduate college approached me to see if I wanted effectively to become a spook, i.e. work for MI6. And I was very intrigued by it. I read a lot of Graham Greene. I went through most of the hoops. And then, I'm very glad to say, decided against it. And I would have hated it because I very much wanted to be a writer and to be completely independent. And that's the reason I decided against it. But what I would say is my fascination with Eastern Europe, which came at an early age, was not sort of Le Carré-esque. It was not about the spying. It was about the dictatorship. That's what really got me, the sense that here were 100 million people who were suffering under sometimes quite Orwellian conditions, as I went on to find in East Germany.
Yes. So you travelled to Berlin. What was your reason for going to Berlin?
The first time I crossed to East Berlin was in 1975, when I was 20, and I then went to live in Berlin in 1978. I was writing a doctorate at Oxford about the Third Reich, about the Nazi dictatorship. I was fascinated by the question what people do about a dictatorship, what makes one person a resistance fighter, and another a collaborator. And what I discovered very quickly was that people were facing exactly these dilemmas in real time, just the other side of the Berlin Wall. So I ended up writing my first book not about Berlin under Adolf Hitler, but about Berlin under Erich Honecker. And I went to live in East Berlin as a history student. So it was the dictatorship and what people do about a dictatorship, and indeed what we in the West could do to help and how to overcome the division symbolized by the Berlin Wall. That was what fascinated me.
Right. And when you first stayed in Berlin, you were in the West, and you stay with quite a number of interesting characters who you describe as the 68ers.
That's right. So, of course, we'd had, this was 78, 68 was 10 years before. All around me were people who had been, as were on the barricades in 1968, which is, of course, very big in Berlin, West Berlin. Some of them had very nearly become terrorists. I have, friends who said I almost became a member of the Baader-Meinhof gang. What fascinated and appalled me was that they all lived with their backs to the Berlin Wall. They were looking for socialism, but they never went just the other side of the Berlin Wall to look at real existing socialism.
Yeah, and it's interesting, obviously, with post-Wende, the discovery that a number of the Red Army faction actually lived in East Germany under assumed names as well.
Yeah, that's right. And the Stasi, as we know, supported them.
Yeah. So you're researching in East Berlin. What difficulties did you have in trying to carry out the research you wanted to in East Berlin?
Well, it was incredibly difficult. I mean, by the way, I have about 5 old dark blue British passports because they kept filling up with the frontier crossing stamps from Checkpoint Charlie and Friedrichstrasse, because you got 2 every time you went over. And since I went over 2 or 3 times a week, you kept having to get a new passport. So it was very difficult because it was a very tightly controlled, surveilled society, and particularly journalists. And my great good fortune was that I was a history student as far as they were concerned. And so even when I was collecting material to write articles and then to write this book about East Germany, I was formally speaking a history student. And actually, I was the first British student to go to East Berlin under a new cultural agreement between the UK and the German Democratic Republic, of which they were very proud of. So they treated me very well, and then were deeply, deeply offended that I wrote a very critical book about East Germany, which was serialized a year later in Der Spiegel. And actually, there was an official diplomatic protest from the East German government to the British government about this book. One of the nicest reviews I've ever received.
Yeah. Now, you obviously were living in East Germany, and as you would expect, the Stasi open a file on you, which is obviously the centerpiece of your book, The File. And I've always amused by your code name.
Yes, as was I. So, of course, as all your listeners know, because of unification, which was East Germany joining West Germany and therefore West Germany taking over, we had this unique opportunity of the entire secret police files being very carefully and systematically opened. So nowhere else in the world ever have we had such an opportunity. And what happens is you apply and then you get permission, and an official of the so-called Gauck Authority, named for Joachim Gauck, the head of it, has read the file before you and done photocopies, blacking out the names, the real names of various people and any personal details. So I go into this room, sit down at a plastic wood table, and Frau Schultz says to me, Guten Tag, Herr Garton Ash. You have a very interesting file, and sort of giggles. And then I look at the cover and it says OPK and then in quotes, Romeo. And I said, what's this? And she said, well, that was your code name. Now, I have to say there are two versions of this. One is the obvious one. The other, which I actually have to admit is more plausible, is that my car at that time was an Alfa Romeo. So there's a prosaic explanation, although I'm quite happy to stick with a romantic one.
Yeah, you wouldn't expect a better code name than that. How did you feel when that file sat on the desk in front of you and you were about to open it?
So as I recount in the book, I suddenly had a moment of panic almost, because I had an East German girlfriend, and I remembered a particular moment where we'd been together in my room in East Berlin, which was a front room with a large window, and we were making love, and she suddenly got up and opened the curtains and turned the light on. And I thought, cripes, was she actually an informer for the Stasi? Was she doing that so they could get, covert photographs of me and then try to compromise me? I'm very glad to say that wasn't there, but there was a real nervousness about it. By the way, later on, when I was writing the book, I went back and looked her up again, and I sort of slightly hesitantly say, why did you turn on the light? And she said, I wanted to see your face. Which fairly sufficient explanation. But that gives a sense of the paranoia, right? But also I was very worried that I would find that close friends had been informing on me. Because, of course, that's the real shocker of reading your Stasi file, is finding people have informed on you. There was one, although I'm glad to say only one, who I would rarely have called a friend.
Right, yeah, we come on to some of the contents in there. But one of the things that did make me laugh is at the time you were writing for The Spectator and they misspelt it as Spectre.
The man from Spectre. Remember the old TV series,
Exactly. Robert Vaughan. But yeah, no, that intrigued me. But also some of the people that you met while you were in East Berlin. The one that I'm particularly intrigued in is Alice or Litzy Coleman, who was Kim Philby's first wife.
Absolutely fascinating. So she was very probably the person who really got him into the spying business. And this was 1930s Vienna. Fascism was on the rise. The communists were the good guys. And there was a kind of romantic involvement in the communist cause. I mean, of course, it started at Cambridge. And she was a very composed, still elegant, articulate, feisty woman who I tried in vain to draw on the subject of Kim Philby. The only thing she would say was that, Kim was very reserved, which I think counts as the understatement of the decade.
Presumably she still believed in the socialist ideals, or did you get any indication that if they'd known what was going on in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, they might have gone down a different path?
I don't think she would tell me that she didn't, but I'm sure she had a very, very clear idea of the horrors that had happened under Stalinism, and I, was quite critical. But there's a really interesting point there, Ian, which I do want to make, which is that, during my time, because I was also working on the Third Reich, I met old communists and old Nazis. Indeed, I met Albert Speer on one memorable occasion. I have never met, so to speak, a noble old fascist. because the vision of society, the ideal of fascism, of Nazism, was itself an oppressive and inhuman one. Right? Albert Speer was one of the coldest atheist human beings I've ever met. But with these old communists, whether they'd stayed in the party or particularly if they'd left it, you still felt the old idealism, because the original ideal was an ideal of liberty and equality, not of the oppression of other races by Übermenschen. So I think that's a really important point. These people could be really quite simpatico. And that was true of one of the people who informed on me, who I was most sad about. I don't know if perhaps I can mention that story to you now.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because it connects. So this was a really elegant, white-haired, cultured old German Jewish lady who had joined the Communist Party in Berlin in the 1930s, which took a lot of courage as a young Jewish girl. Hitler had come to power. She and her husband fled to the Soviet Union. Husband was in the camps, Stalin's camps, for many, many years and died later from the damage to his health. She was in a labor army. They'd suffered terribly. Then they came back to East Germany. Things went well, but the husband died. They had a child. Their son fled to the West soon before the Berlin Wall was thrown up. She couldn't, of course, go and visit him. And then the Stasi came to her and said, Frau so and so, we know you're a good comrade. We know your son is in the West. Just tell us a little about cultural life in East Germany. We know you have good connections with artists and writers and actors. And then maybe you can go and visit your son, right? So it's a classic illustration of recruitment. Partly, you believe in the cause, but also a clear blackmail. And so she started very sort of innocuous, informing on cultural life. And then, like a fisherman playing in a fish, they gradually reeled her in, so that in the end, she was informing in considerable detail on people like me. It's such a tragic story, because here was a really noble, idealistic young woman, and that's where she ends up.
And I think that's an interesting piece of the book, because you confront her over the contents of the file, and afterwards you feel some guilt, particularly with what you've just remarked on about the period in the Soviet labor camp and her husband never recovering from his ordeal there.
Yeah, I mean, listen, absolutely, notionally, in the categories of the law on the Stasi files, I'm a victim and she's a perpetrator or a collaborator. But she was much more a victim than I was. The worst that happened to me was that I was kicked out of the country and refused re-entry for a number of years in the 1980s because they were so, annoyed with me. But that didn't really damage my life significantly at all, whereas she had really, really suffered. So, behind these simple categories of the victim and the perpetrator, you always have to look at the individual story. Another quick story, which I think illustrates this, which I'm not sure if I put in the book. One of the great heroes of 1989 in East Germany was a guy called Jens Reich, who was a scientist who led the civic movement. He told me that a friend of his who'd been having an affair back in the old East Germany days, the Stasi had approached him and said, we know you're having an affair. We're going to tell your wife. That'll be the end of your marriage. So he agreed to inform on Jens, but he immediately came to Jens and said, listen, this is what's happened. They've got me by the short and curlies. I'm going to have to do this, but let's agree what I report. And so, for months and years, they agreed what he was going to report on Jens Reich. And as Jens said, if he, Jens Reich, had no longer been alive, nobody would have believed that story.
It's a really interesting story there. I wanted to move on to Poland.
Solidarność, solidarity movement, had erupted in Poland, and I can't tell you how, Ian, how unexpected and surprising and amazing that was. Eastern Europe in 1979 was still very grey, very much under control of the Soviet Union and the communist regimes, quite Orwellian in many ways in places like East Germany, Romania. Poland was somewhat different, but the notion that suddenly you could have a 10 million strong movement for freedom, which would last 16 months, this was totally unheard of.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. I mean, it was shocking looking from the outside and seeing how far solidarity got. Now, you go to Gdansk. You're on holiday actually in Italy, I believe, and you hear about the strikes and realize that you need to be there. And you get to Gdansk. Can you describe the atmosphere in Gdansk and the scene when you first entered the shipyard?
Yeah, absolutely. So as soon as I heard about the strikes on the BBC World Service, shortwave radio, right, I get on a train to Berlin. I actually got my visa at the Polish consulate in East Berlin. And when the guy asked me why I wanted to go, I said, well, I want to study the Polish resistance to Hitler. So the purpose of visit on the visa form said Polish resistance, which I was rather pleased with.
Brilliant.
And then got to Warsaw and then straight up to Gdańsk. A bright, warm August day. We get to the shipyard, crowds of people outside, the shipyard gates festooned with flowers and a picture of Pope John Paul II. And we give our names and say we're journalists. And the gate opens, and there are two lines of shipyard workers in blue overalls, unshaven, tired but determined, and they applaud us on the way in as if we had brought the diplomatic support of our countries to this occupation strike. It was utterly, utterly unforgettable. And the atmosphere in this huge shipyard with these enormous shipyard cranes and half-finished, ferries and boats all around us was a mixture of tremendous elation and excitement, music playing, lots of joking. I remember at one point over the tannoy system came the Beatles' Yellow Submarine. We all live in a yellow submarine. On the one hand, but on the other hand, enormous tension. Because what you have to remember is that at this very, very place, just in front of this shipyard gate, only 10 years before, in December 1970, shipyard workers had been shot by the Polish army and security forces when they tried to go out to protest, to demonstrate on the streets. And of course, behind the communist regime, there was the Soviet Union and the fear of Soviet intervention. The Soviets had, after all, invaded Czechoslovakia only 12 years before. So it was this really extraordinary mixture of fate, of festival, and extreme tension, like a siege.
Yeah, I think you describe it in your book, The Polish Revolution, as the workers are described as like extras in an Eisenstein film. And you also talk about their quiet dignity, which was a really great, created a really strong image for me.
Yes. I mean, the extraordinary thing, and I've seen this again in 1989, is that in these sort of revolutionary moments, people sometimes do look exactly like people in the Eisenstein film, right? They strike poses like the great revolutionary figures. But, dignity in 1980, which, by the way, for me, was really a formative experience. People often associate my name with 1989, which was an amazing moment, of course. But people forget that Poland was the icebreaker. And this was really the first attempted revolution in Central Europe, which led directly to 1989. And it was all about recovering dignity, what the Polish Pope had preached on his first pilgrimage to his native land the year before. So, for example, the communist authorities very quickly tried to buy off the strikers by offering them more money, quite a lot more money. And they said, no, this is not about money. This is about getting a memorial outside those gates to the shipyard workers who were killed in 1970. And it's about having independent trade unions. Not about money, it's about dignity.
Yeah. What did you make of the strike leaders?
Well, these were genuinely workers. This was, in its origins, genuinely a workers' revolution, which is very unusual, right? I mean, the Bolshevik Revolution or the seizure of power by communists in Eastern Europe in the 1940s were not genuinely workers' revolutions. Lech Wałęsa was this skinny, mobile wag. He was a kind of, the works wag, the guy you'd go down to the pub with for a really good gas. And he was very funny and very quick. And you see him today, this stout, portly, stiff, ex-presidential figure, and you have no idea of what this 38-year-old was like. As I say in the book, he had a touch of Charlie Chaplin about him too.
Did you interview him?
Oh, absolutely. Of course, I talked to all of them, and they were really extraordinary figures. I mean, Wałęsa. I mean, I now speak fluent Polish, but even if you have fluent Polish, he's often quite difficult to understand. He's really all over the place. I remember talking to someone who had to interpret him for Margaret Thatcher. And he said it was the most difficult 2 hours of his life.
Yes, because she makes quite a memorable visit there, I think, in 1988. At the time, do you think they really believed that they would be successful?
In 1980?
In 1980, yes, sorry.
It depends very much what we mean by success here. Because, looking back from now, we think of success as being getting rid of the communists and, becoming a democracy. That nobody thought was in the cards in 1980-81. The question then was, are we going to get another month or another 2 months? I think they thought after, say, 6 months that there was just a chance that they could get some kind of a compromise, some kind of a modus vivendi with the communist authorities. And of course, in that, they ultimately failed. But I don't think it was a failure, because to have 16 months of freedom is not a failure, right? So take Belarus today. Maybe Lukashenko will ultimately succeed in clamping down for some years to come. Who knows? He has the army and security forces on his side and Putin behind him. But those people in Belarus will have had 2 months of freedom, 3 months of freedom. And that changes a country forever. Poland, after those 16 months, was just a completely different country.
Yeah. And, you say it started as a workers' strike, but then they do get assistance from the intelligentsia, so like Jacek Kuron and
Bronisław Geremek, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, all the people who would then play a really leading role in 1989. What was so unique and unprecedented about this moment was that 3 classes, if you will, who had so often been divided in East European history, namely the at the time we still said the peasants, the farmers, and many of them were actually, peasants in a classical European sense, the workers, and the intelligentsia, those people with higher education, it's a very important large group of people in all East European countries, all came together in one big movement called Solidarity, right? That had never happened before. And what is more, Catholics and socialists came together. The secular left and the Catholics all came together. So it was an extraordinary experience of, the clue is in the name, solidarity, right? It was unbelievably inspiring to see such different people working together. There was an amazing spirit. It's rather like what George Orwell describes on the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War.
Yes, I think you describe it in the book as your Spain or something. I can't remember exactly how.
Yes, as my Spain. So what I meant by that, my great inspiration as a political writer was George Orwell, still is, and particularly homage to Catalonia, right? And so what Orwell does, he doesn't pretend to be impartial. He says, I'm on the Republican side, I'm on the Democratic side, but I've told you what side I'm on, and I'm going to be honest with you about what I saw and heard. And I'm, in a way, going to be most critical of my own side, just because it is my own side. And that's what I tried to do in Poland. There was no question that I was on the Solidarity side, 200%. And indeed, later in the 1980s, I would bring in wads of dollars and messages and so on for the Underground Solidarity and Samizdat Publishing and so on. I make no apology for that. I was a courier to and from the free world, coming from foundations, by the way, not from the CIA, in case anyone thinks that was. So I was absolutely up, but I tried to be as honest as I could. I spoke to people on the regime side, gave their point of view, and I don't think I was too starry-eyed about Solidarity itself.
No. And were you in the room when the historic agreement was signed with Lech Walensa's ridiculously large pen?
I spent many days in that room, but my visa ran out, so I wasn't actually there for that moment. One thing people forget about the Cold War, particularly younger Europeans who are used just to sort of, waking up on Friday morning and booking an EasyJet flight to Tallinn or Krakow, is we spent unbelievable amounts of time just trying to get the bloody visas. Life was dominated by the quest for the visa.
Yeah. Now, you do return to Poland on a number of occasions. I think you come over for the Pope's visit post the declaration of martial law.
That was just extraordinary, next to the Lenin shipyard in August 1980. So this society which has gone through martial law, my friends have been interned or imprisoned or in exile. There's a great sense of hopelessness, but also a sort of grim determination to carry on. And suddenly in comes the Pope, the man in white. There we are in front of the Jasna Gora, the amazing monastery in Częstochowa. Hundreds of thousands of people, all with national flags and pictures of the Black Madonna and, of course, Solidarność flags, waiting for him, full of nervous expectation. And there he appears, the white figure on the distant steps, a dais in front of the red brick walls of the fortress monastery. And the crowds in these moments have an extraordinary ability to speak with one voice as if they are one person. And so people started saying, we can't hear you properly. And the Pope said, okay, I'm coming nearer. And so he walks down the steps. And then the crowd starts chanting, a chair for the Pope, a chair for the Pope. And so some monk stumbles after him with a chair. And he'd established this extraordinary contact. It was as if it was a one-to-one conversation between John Paul II, who was a great actor. John Gielgud said his delivery was theatrically perfect. and these hundreds of thousands of people. And he gave them back their hope. He said, we need to persevere in hope. And that is one of the things that kept, the hopes of solidarity alive through those very dark years, sort of into 1984.
Yeah, absolutely. And in 84, you return, but for a sadder occasion.
Well, that's right. So, I mean, I was, going in whenever I could get a visa, and I had actually, I think, been in one time before in 84. Now, one of the people I'd met on the occasion of the Pope's visit in 83 was an extraordinary, intense, slim priest called Father Jerzy Popiełuszko. And Jerzy Popiełuszko had become the kind of solidarity chaplain of the big steelworks in Warsaw, the Huta Warszawa steelworks. And he was very militant, particularly fired up with the Pope. I remember him saying to me that the kingdom of Satan must fall. What do I have to fear? He actually said to me. Well, a year later, we learned what he had to fear because he was kidnapped by 3 rogue secret policemen, thrown into the boot of a car, repeatedly beaten up until he was probably unconscious. And then his body was weighted down with a bag of heavy stones, and he was thrown into a reservoir, probably still alive at the moment he was thrown into the water, and of course drowned. And this was something so utterly shocking, even for people who'd been through martial law. Even the regime was really upset by it, I have to say, because the secret police were subsequently put on trial. And I attended the funeral for Jerzy Popiełuszko, which is the most amazing, emotional, patriotic, religious, political event, as only the Poles can do. I mean, the moment I will never forget was an engineer at the steelworks at Warszawa, who'd been a friend of his. As the church bells were ringing, this guy said, Jurek, which is a familiar form of Jerzy. It's rather like sounds like Jim or Bill, right? He said, Jurek, can you hear how the bells of freedom ring?
Wow.
Such an amazing moment.
Yeah.
But freedom still seemed a long way away. Remember, it wasn't Mr. Gorbachev in the Kremlin. That was November 1984. It was Mr. Chernenko. And honestly, at that time, it's really important to remember, most of us, including most of my dissident friends all across Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel, who I got to know in Hungary, all of them thought the Soviet Union would be with us for decades to come.
Yeah, and so did I. Certainly.
It's really important to remember that Poland was the icebreaker for the rest of Central Europe in this. I mean, it was 10 years hard struggle in Poland. And actually, before 89, I was there in 1988 and witnessed another occupation strike in the Lenin shipyard. The shipyard was blocked off by riot police, so you couldn't go in through the gate. But a couple of shipyard workers actually smuggled me over a wall around the back of the shipyard, and I remember walking, underneath the hulls of vast half-finished tankers and right the way through to the strike headquarters, where I found Lech Wałęsa sound asleep flat on the floor in his carpet slippers, snoring, I have to say. And when he'd woken up, he started, we started talking, and he started saying what they were going to do next. Tadeusz Mazowiecki, one of his key advisors, subsequently the first non-communist prime minister of Poland for more than 40 years, was advising him. And I'll never forget Wałęsa saying to Tadeusz Mazowiecki, Panie Tadeuszu, Mr. Tadeusz, you're the man for negotiations. You're the man for wisdom. Now, this was partly because he thought you needed an intellectual to do the negotiations, but also because Wałęsa, with his superb political instinct, he had a brilliant political instinct, understood that they weren't going to win this time. And they'd have to cut some sort of a deal. And in the end, they walked out of the shipyard arm in arm behind a large wooden cross. But it looked as if they'd been defeated. But actually, that was one of the moments when General Jaruzelski and the authorities realized solidarity is not dead. Solidarity is coming back. We cannot recover the economy without getting the West to lift its sanctions. Gorbachev is encouraging us to do our own thing. So let's start putting out feelers to see if we can have a negotiation. And my dear friend, much missed, great historian and solidarity advisor, Bronisław Geremek, subsequently a Polish foreign minister, was one of the people who invented this idea of a round table negotiation. So the theory was all the different forces in Polish society, the church, the unions, officials, etc., were all coming together at a round table. The round table, by the way, still exists. You can go and visit it in Warsaw, a rather sort of cheap bit of carpentry. But of course, actually, Ian, as I said at the time, the round table was actually a rectangular table. There were basically two sides, Solidarity and the communist authorities. And what came out of that was an agreement which saw the legalization of Solidarity, but crucially, it saw agreement to a semi-free election, which happened on the 4th of June, 1989. And this was absolutely the moment of breakthrough, because Solidarity in that election won every seat they could possibly have won, bar one actually, but almost every seat, the 99 out of 100 seats in the upper house. And that was a moment at which the authorities more or less threw up their hands and said, that's it. I mean, they tried to form a government with a communist prime minister, but failed. So that really was the 4th of June, 1989, was the absolute spectacular moment of breakthrough. And I've never forgotten going to vote with my Samizdat publisher, my underground publisher, and seeing the great photos, which shows Gary Cooper in high noon, and Gary Cooper marching down, Main Street, wearing a Solidarność badge, and it said high noon, 4th of June, 1989.
Yeah, that's a very evocative poster. I've seen that poster, and I'll make sure we show that in the show notes. And I 100% agree with you that Poland was the icebreaker, as you describe it. Without Poland, the Berlin Wall doesn't fall. The rest of that domino effect probably wouldn't have happened.
Yes, I mean, the Poles like to say, and it's a bit self-congratulatory, but I think it's true, that Solidarność punched the first hole in the Berlin Wall. Of course, none of it could have happened without Gorbachev. They never succeeded without Gorbachev. The other bit of that, which is really important, is, of course, the Hungarian bit. Hungary, of course, had been, and again, I was going there regularly, was much more tolerant, a much more open, much more reform-minded regime. By 1989, they were already starting a negotiated transition. The reform-minded leaders had basically decided that they needed to start switching sides and develop good relations with Germany, particularly, and what was still the West European community. But of course, the key thing they did was to cut the Iron Curtain, open the Iron Curtain to Austria. And when I say cut, literally cut the barbed wire with huge wire cutters. And the son of one of my best friends in East Berlin actually escaped across that frontier from Hungary to Austria. And that was so crucial because it kick-started the mass protests in East Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to talk about the Velvet Revolution, and similar to my first question with Poland, is what was the atmosphere like when you arrived in Prague?
So I had been going in and out of Prague throughout the 1980s. My friends, the dissidents, were working as stokers or watchmen. You would meet them in overalls or in their off-duty hours. Václav Havel had been in and out of prison. The first time I met him, he'd just come out from a 4-year prison sentence. I compared it to being under a thick layer of ice. So while things were moving in Poland and Hungary, nothing had seemed to be moving in Czechoslovakia. Very small, Charter 77 was a very small group of dissidents, right? And indeed, not so much is moving, even in early 89. It's very much a frozen regime and only a few thousand protesters. But Poland goes, Hungary goes, East Germany goes, and then there I am in East Berlin, and I read the news that a big student demonstration has been broken up in Prague and one student has been killed, which, by the way, turned out to be untrue. So I immediately go off to the Czech consulate in East Berlin, get a visa, take the train, track down Václav Havel in his favorite basement pub. He was a great man for the pub, and many mugs of beer and chasers like Becherovka. He was a bohemian in both senses, as someone who lived in, that is, Bohemia, and a bohemian in his lifestyle. And we were just sitting having a drink, and I said to him, you know, Vaslav, in Poland it took 10 years, in Hungary it took 10 months, in East Germany it took 10 weeks, maybe here it'll take 10 days. And he so much liked that bon mot that he called over the samizdat video team and had me repeat that to camera. I've still got the film of it. And then he was asked to comment, and he said it'd be great if it were true, which, by the way, it very nearly was, because it took a little bit longer, but by mid-December, less than a month thereafter, it was all over and he was the candidate for president. And then we moved to the Magic Lantern Theatre, which, suitably enough for a playwright, was the headquarters of the revolution. And the whole thing was unbelievably theatrical. The press conferences were held from the stage of the theatre. There was still the stage set for the Minotaur. Havel would emerge through the tunnel, the Minotaur's tunnel, to speak to us. And I've never forgotten the moment when both Havel and Dubček, the hero of 68, were together on stage, and the news came through that the whole Politburo had resigned. And everybody erupted in applause, including all the foreign press, of course. Havel and Dubček, you know, the man of 89 and the man of 68, embraced very warmly. Champagne was produced from somewhere. It was like a fairy tale. And then you would go out onto Wenceslas Square, 300,000 people all waving their keys to make the sound of Chinese bells. I mean, it was a fairy tale and magical, and sort of became the archetypal Velvet Revolution. But by the way, it was the first one to be called a Velvet Revolution. And it was probably a French journalist who invented the term, which was then taken up by the Czechs. But it was also, in some sense, unrepresentative, because the Berlin Wall had already fallen. Everyone could see that the Soviet bloc was finished in its original form. I mean, if you want to put a date to the end of the Cold War, it has to be the 9th of November 1989 in Berlin, right? So it was a sort of magical theatrical postscript.
Yeah. I mean, Havel is an interesting character. I always think. I mean, what was his leadership style like?
If you met him, he was incredibly courteous and seemed tremendously diffident, soft-spoken, always apologetic, always had time for everyone. And yet he had an absolutely unique authority. And in these sort of chaotic situations with everybody piling in, it was, if you like, a sort of guided democracy, right? Because he just had, partly because of his personality, partly because of his biography, and also because of his international reputation, his fame, if you like. He just had a unique authority. And there was briefly an idea that Dubček might be, so to speak, the Democratic candidate for president. But Dubček was an old man and the man of 68. And apart from Dubček, it just had to be Havel. I remember we were together at the moment when students had started producing little badges saying Havel na hrad, which means Havel to the castle, i.e. Havel for president. And Vaslav, very sort of diffidently and almost apologetically, said, "Oh, that's rather nice. Could I have one?" And, 6 weeks later, there he was, being inaugurated in a grand ceremony in Prague Castle in a very rapidly tailor-made suit, famously with trousers that were much too short. Because until then, he'd only worn jeans and sweaters.
Yeah. No, you can see he's uncomfortable wearing a suit. With Alexander Dubček, I mean, he still was in favour of some form of communism, even in 1989, wasn't he?
It's pretty hard to say what. I mean, I think his socialism with a human face was getting on towards a sort of democratic socialism or social democracy. But the much more important point is that Gorbachev thought that you could still have socialism with a human face. Gorbachev was friends with a man called Zdeněk Mlynář, who'd been one of the key thinkers of 1968. They'd studied together in Moscow. And one reason Gorbachev let things go so far in Eastern Europe was precisely that he thought that you could reach a better socialism with a human face. He thought there was a sort of halfway house where you'd still have communist rule, but it'd be quite democratic and quite humane, which was an illusion. And so I always like to say that in 1989, the Central Europeans were the beneficiaries of their own illusions 21 years before in 1968, right? Because they had developed this idea of the socialism with a human face, which Gorbachev still believed in, but most Central Europeans did not. And indeed, on the first edition of The Magic Lantern, my book about the Velvet Revolutions, we show a poster, a hand-drawn poster I saw in Prague during the Velvet Revolution, which had 68 rotated for 180 degrees, which of course makes 89.
Yeah. I hadn't thought of that. When you look back over your time in Eastern Europe through this critical period, what is your most vivid memory? Big question.
There are so many, because honestly, it was 12, even 15 years of the most intense and formative experience of my life. So it's very difficult to single out one. But if you put a pistol to my head, whereas most people would expect me to say the fall of the wall or the Velvet Revolution with Václav Havel, which are, of course, great memories, but it would have to be that day in August 1980, when Brezhnev was still in the Kremlin, the Cold War was getting even colder. There was a danger of nuclear war. We thought the Red Army might march in any day. No one could imagine that the Berlin Wall would come down within 10 years. But here were these people, these quote-unquote ordinary people, workers and farmers, standing up for freedom and fighting for the freedom of their country. And I will never forget that day in the August sunlight.
That's a great image. I had a number of questions from people who asked them on Twitter. The first one is, how did you have the presence of mind in 1989 and 1980 to write everything down as it was happening?
Because I was by training a historian, and what I was setting out to do was to be a very contemporary historian, what I called a historian of the present. And so that was my main job, was to write everything down in notebook after notebook. By the way, I'm now working on a personal history of contemporary Europe, and I have just meters and meters of notebooks in which I really did just write it all down.
Wow. Well, so you didn't use cassette recorder or anything like that? It's all handwritten?
So what many people today will need to be reminded is we didn't have smartphones.
If only you did. Imagine what you would have captured.
Well, that's right. I think they're a great tool for the contemporary historian, but the technology was very primitive. So I did have a cassette recorder, and I would use it, if I went off to interview the head of government or something. And I do have some sound recordings from the time, but for the most part, it was the old-fashioned reporter notebook, writing it down at the time. And here I am, 40 years later, deciphering my scrawl.
Okay. The next question we had was, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Eastern Bloc owes a great debt to Jan Palach. Why is he not a household name?
That's a great question. So just to remind your listeners, Jan Palach was a student in Prague who, in protest against the Soviet invasion and occupation of Czechoslovakia, set fire to himself on Wenceslas Square in 1969 and died subsequently from his burns, a really tragic story. And there is a sort of Kafkaesque postscript to this, which, funnily enough, only today I was writing about for my new book, which is that he was buried in Prague, and of course his grave became a place of pilgrimage, as you would expect. So one night, the secret police just removed his body, had it cremated, and delivered the urn to his mother in a small country town, and buried an old woman from a care home, a woman called Marie Jedličková, in his place. So the next time someone turned up, it was Marie Jedličková's grave. I mean, isn't that an Orwellian, a Kafkaesque moment? Wow. But they weren't going to be defeated. So they put the flowers and the candles and the sign saying, "We remember," on the grave of Marie Jedličková. I think I can feel the hair standing up on the nape of my neck when I tell that story. And I actually went and found that grave, and just across the road, Franz Kafka is buried in the Jewish graveyard. So I think the reason he's not remembered enough, as he should be, is that that was, as it were, from the heroic period of resistance after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, which in a sense failed because you then had 20 years of so-called normalization. And it stands as a kind of a moment of heroic martyrdom, whereas because of the Velvet Revolution and Havel, what people really associate with Czechoslovakia now, with Prague specifically, is the successful revolution.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. That period of 68 is certainly overshadowed by 89, and those other periods like Poland in 1970, and all of those other.
They really are, I think, and I think an awful lot of people, if you said the Prague Spring, they wouldn't know which year that was, 68, or even if you said the Hungarian Revolution, 1956, which was another great, very courageous uprising. I think that's been forgotten. Now, at the time, up to 89, those were the dates everyone knew and everyone thought of. 53 in East Berlin, 56 in Budapest, 68 in Prague, 70 on the Baltic coast, 80 Poland. Those were the milestones. But now it's as if the story begins in 89.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the designs behind this podcast, is to make people aware there's more to the Cold War than the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989.
Well, exactly. And also, it's really important to remind people that we didn't know how the story was how this movie ends. And, the tension, the excitement, the hope, the fear, all came from that not knowing. And it's so difficult to recapture those emotions, even for me, let alone for someone who's younger today, when you know how the movie ends.
Yeah, indeed. The next question is, the collaboration of Czech and Polish dissidents is well known, but was there a broader regional collaboration of anti-communist groups, or did everyone stew in their own sauce?
There wasn't what one would call a regional collaboration, because that was too difficult to organize. But there were lots of bilateral connections. So, for example, there were a couple of East German dissidents who were particularly interested in Poland and had close ties with Poland. And in particular, the dissidents in Hungary were absolutely fascinated by Poland. I remember Laszlo Reich, who was a great friend of mine, actually going several times to Poland in the early 1980s. And one of those young opposition figures who was really inspired by Poland, by solidarity, was Viktor Orban, who then was a young liberal student leader. And to this day, he is still, even though he's become a kind of dictator, and I'm absolutely horrified by what he's doing to his own country and by what he's become himself, interested only in power and money. But at that time, he was a sharp, idealistic-seeming young guy, and in awe of what the Poles had done. So there were lots of, as it were, bilateral connections, and worth also mentioning, this is important, that they also thought of themselves very much in a conversation with people like Andrej Amalrik, Nathan Sharansky, Andrei Sakharov, Yelena Bona. I mean, the great Soviet dissidents, for my friend Adam Michnik and others, they were as much a reference point as anyone elsewhere in Eastern Europe.
My view is that the Helsinki Accords is one of the critical areas that helps these dissident groups at least have some defense from the authoritarian governments they're battling against.
Yeah, that is true, although there's also a bit of a Helsinki mythology. Remember that at the time, the Soviets regarded Helsinki as a great triumph, because what it secured for them was recognition of the post-war territorial settlement and the division of Europe. That's how they saw it. And many dissidents felt betrayed. I remember conversations with people who felt betrayed and let down by it. And it wasn't Western policymakers who really developed the potential of Helsinki contained in its human rights provisions and the basket 3 on human contacts. It was East European oppositionists who suddenly thought, well, we can use this as a reference point. Hey, you published this on the front page of Neues Deutschland or, Ruda Pravo or Pravda, the Communist Party papers. So we're simply asking for our rights under this international treaty. And then that was picked up by very brave and pioneering NGO activists in the West and by the Jimmy Carter administration. And so Helsinki only becomes the Helsinki we think of, i.e. the human rights thing, the thing that's supporting the campaign for human rights in the late 1970s. That wasn't what it was at the time in 1975.
Right. One last question, which is, what was particular about Poland that allowed such an organisation like Solidarność to flourish? And was organised resistance more widespread in Poland than other Eastern Bloc countries, especially East Germany?
Unambiguously, yes. That's what fascinated me coming from East Germany, where there was a tiny handful of outright dissidents, to a country where, Orwell's 1984 was being read in churches. And of course, simple questions require complicated answers, but a few unique features of Poland. Firstly, private farming and some parts of the private sector in the economy were never fully collectivized and abolished. Secondly, the Catholic Church, which was enormously powerful and had traditionally for centuries been the bearer of, as it were, the mission of of national independence. So you had these powerful forces that were much more independent of the communist state. And then you had this long tradition of dissidents and opposition, both workers and intellectuals, which goes back to the Polish October in 1956, Władysław Gomułka, reform communists like my great friend and Oxford colleague Leszek Kłakowski, big 68 movement, people like Adam Michnik, Jacek Koron, the workers in 1970, the Workers' Defense Committee formed in 1976. So there's a long tradition of kind of building up of forms of popular resistance, which was an old Polish habit because for more than a century, the Poles didn't have their own state. So they were used to building an underground state, an alternative society. And all of that came together in the Solidarity movement, so that through the 1980s, you just had tens and even hundreds of thousands of people who were involved in oppositional activity in Poland. And that was completely unique in the whole Soviet world.
Right. Professor Timothy Garton Ash, thank you so much for sharing your time with me. That has been a fascinating chat.
It was a real pleasure.
And we have further information such as videos and links in our show notes, which will show as a link in your podcast app. Now, you wouldn't be listening to this podcast without the generous support of our patrons. However, I want to especially thank our Politburo level members who are contributing a generous $30 a month to keep us on the air. These are Tony Sowards, Sam Hardwick, Nicholas Butter, Frederick Esposito, Jeffrey Jones and Peter Ryan. Don't forget, if you like one of those Cold War Conversations coasters and help support the show, then head over to coldwarconversations.com/donate. If you can't wait for the next episode, please visit our Facebook discussion group, where listeners just like you continue the Cold War conversation. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thank you very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.